Imagine a man who never spent a single night in jail. A kingpin who operated from the shadows while his more famous rivals were gunned down or imprisoned. A multimillionaire criminal whose name was scarcely known to the public. A boss who ordered brutal executions yet dined with his family every night. A figure so untouchable that decades of investigation by the FBI led to nothing but frustration and closed files. This was not a character from a film. This was the real, breathing, and terrifyingly efficient reality of Anthony "Tony" Accardo, the man who would become the most successful and enduring godfather in the history of American organized crime. His story is not just one of violence, though there was an ocean of it, but a masterclass in corporate-style management, strategic silence, and a psychological understanding of power that left every other mobster in his dust. Before we delve into the shadowy corridors of his life, we must issue a clear disclaimer. The narrative we are about to unfold is pieced together from decades of law enforcement reports, declassified FBI files, court testimonies, and historical accounts from journalists and biographers. The nature of Accardo's life means that absolute, irrefutable truth is often elusive, hidden behind a wall of omerta, the code of silence. Our purpose is not to glorify his actions, which were often heinous, but to present a comprehensive and accurate chronicle of his rise, his reign, and his unprecedented downfall from natural causes, aiming to bring you the most complete picture possible from the available information. So if you are ready to journey into a world where the line between corporate boardroom and criminal conspiracy blurs into nothingness, make yourself comfortable, and let us begin. The year is 1906, and in the heart of Chicago, a city already pulsing with immigrant dreams and industrial grit, a child is born to poor Italian immigrants from Sicily. His name, given to him on April 28th, is Anthony Accardo. The Chicago he entered was a cauldron of opportunity and exploitation, a place where the desperate struggles of working-class families in crowded tenements stood in stark contrast to the gleaming fortunes being made in steel and meatpacking. This environment, this pressure cooker of ambition and deprivation, was the perfect breeding ground for a certain kind of ambition, one that saw the law not as a guide, but as an obstacle for the foolish. Young Tony was not a scholar. The classroom held little appeal for a boy who saw faster, more tangible rewards on the streets. He learned his first lessons not from books but from the hustle of the neighborhood, running errands for older boys who already had a swagger in their step and money in their pockets. He was a natural, with a fierce intelligence and a physical presence that belied his youth. He didn't seek trouble, but he never backed down from it, understanding instinctively that in this world respect was not given, it was taken. His first foray into the economy of the streets was as a simple newsboy, but he quickly realized that the real profit wasn't in selling papers but in the information he could overhear, the connections he could make, and the small, seemingly insignificant tasks he could perform for the men who mattered. He was building a network. One casual introduction, one delivered message, one act of minor loyalty at a time. It was during these formative years that he caught the eye of the one man who would change the trajectory of his life forever, the rising and notoriously violent star of the Chicago underworld, Al Capone. Capone's organization, the Outfit, was a brutal corporate entity, and he was always on the lookout for young, reliable, and fearlessly loyal soldiers. Accardo, with his quiet demeanor and obvious competence, was recruited not as a strategist, but as an enforcer. His job was simple: to persuade. And Tony Accardo possessed a singular, terrifying talent for persuasion. He did not need a gun, at least not always. His sheer physical power, his cold, unwavering stare, and a reputation that was quickly building for utter ruthlessness were often enough. He became a collector of debts, a deliverer of warnings, and when those warnings were ignored, a bringer of final, brutal consequences. It was in this role that he earned the nickname that would follow him like a shadow for the rest of his life: Joe Batters. The story goes that Capone himself, impressed by Accardo's proficiency with a baseball bat during the violent interrogation, a euphemism for a savage beating, of several uncooperative rivals, bestowed the name upon him. "This kid is a real Joe Batters," Capone allegedly exclaimed. A dark compliment to Accardo's relentless, crushing force. This was not a nickname he cherished. It was a brand, a constant reminder of his violent origins, the foundation upon which his entire empire would be built. He was now indelibly marked, a core member of Capone's inner circle, trusted with the most sensitive and violent tasks. He was present during the tectonic shifts of the Chicago underworld, the brutal territorial wars that carved up the city's illicit trades, bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, among a handful of powerful syndicates. He learned his trade not from a distance, but in the front lines, in the back alleys and warehouses where the real business of the mob was conducted with lead pipes and baseball bats. He saw firsthand the consequences of flashy high-profile leadership, of drawing too much attention from the press and the authorities. He watched as his mentor, Capone, became a national celebrity, his face splashed across every newspaper, his every move chronicled by a captivated and horrified public, and he saw where that led, to intense scrutiny, to federal investigation, and ultimately to prison. This was perhaps the most critical lesson young Tony Accardo ever learned. He internalized the flaws of the Capone model and began to formulate his own philosophy, a blueprint for a different kind of criminal enterprise, one that operated not on notoriety, but on invisibility, not on public bravado, but on private, unassailable control. He was a student of the game, and he was quickly becoming its most brilliant and most dangerous theoretician. The fall of Al Capone was not an ending, but a restructuring, a corporate takeover orchestrated by the board of directors he had once commanded. As Capone was shipped off to Alcatraz on tax evasion charges, a stark lesson Accardo would never forget. The Chicago outfit did not crumble. It simply evolved, and in this new ecosystem, Tony Joe Batters Accardo found his path to power widening. The era of the flamboyant public-facing boss was over. The era of the quiet, corporate-style manager was beginning, and Accardo was its archetype. He served under the new frontman, Frank the Enforcer Nitti, but it was clear that the real power was coalescing around a triumvirate of sharper, more discreet minds: Paul the waiter Rica, the sophisticated political fixer; Murray the camel Humphreys, a genius at corruption and labor racketeering; and Accardo himself, the enforcer turned strategic partner. This was his postgraduate education in crime, moving beyond the brutal simplicity of the baseball bat and into the complex, shadowy realms of high finance and political manipulation. He learned from Rica the art of patience, of building long-term relationships with politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials, not through intimidation alone, but through mutually beneficial arrangements, a silent partnership where favors were the currency and silence was the dividend. From Humphreys, a man who never threw a punch himself, he learned the immense power of controlling labor unions, of leveraging pension funds, and of infiltrating legitimate businesses, understanding that controlling a trucking route or a jukebox distributorship could be more profitable and infinitely less risky than robbing a bank. Accardo was a voracious learner, absorbing these lessons and integrating them with his own innate understanding of fear and loyalty. He no longer needed to be the one swinging the bat. He was now the one giving the order. His authority so absolute that a mere glance or a softly spoken word was enough to set catastrophic events into motion. His personal life became a fortress of normalcy, a deliberate and calculated facade designed to deflect attention. He married Clarice Porter, a woman far removed from the underworld, and together they built a family life in a comfortable, but not ostentatious suburban home. He was a devoted father, present at dinners, involved in his children's lives, a pillar of his local community. This was his masterpiece of deception. The split between the ruthless mob boss and the dependable family man was so complete, so seamless, that it became his greatest armor. While other mobsters flaunted their wealth with flashy cars and garish suits, Accardo cultivated an image of a successful, if slightly mysterious, businessman. He dressed conservatively, spoke sparingly, and conducted his illicit affairs from anonymous offices and back rooms of restaurants, leaving no paper trail, making no boastful phone calls. He understood the emerging threat of electronic surveillance long before it became a standard tool. operating on the assumption that every room might have a microphone and every phone might be tapped. This paranoia was his professionalism. His commands were delivered in person, in coded language, or through a chain of intermediaries so long and convoluted that it was impossible for any prosecutor to connect him directly to a crime. He presided over the outfit's expansion with the cool head of a CEO, reviewing a quarterly report. The end of Prohibition had forced a diversification of revenue streams, and under his guidance, the outfit plunged deeper into the fertile grounds of Las Vegas, using Teamsters Union pension funds as their private investment capital to build casino empires. They muscled into the emerging jukebox and vending machine industry, creating a nationwide monopoly through a company called the Music Operators of America, a business that provided perfect cash-rich cover for money laundering and territorial control. Every corner of the city's life that could be taxed, they taxed. The gambling dens, the bookmaking operations, the prostitution rings, all paid a tribute upwards. A smooth, efficient system of collection that he oversaw. He managed the outfit's most valuable asset, its reputation for violence. The threat of Joe Batters was always there, simmering beneath the surface of every business negotiation, a ghost from the past that gave weight to his present demands. But the violence itself became surgical, precise, and most importantly, deniable. When a problem arose that required a permanent solution, Accardo would not be in the same city. He would be at a family function or on a fishing trip, creating an ironclad alibi while his orders were carried out with chilling efficiency by a new generation of enforcers who looked up to him with a mixture of fear and reverence. He became the kingmaker, the final arbiter of disputes, the man whose approval was needed for any major decision. By the late 1940s, after Paul Ricca served a brief prison stint, the mantle of ultimate authority settled quietly, almost imperceptibly, onto Tony Accardo's shoulders. He was not the official boss in the way Capone had been. Titles were meaningless and dangerous. He was the de facto chairman of the board, the consensus choice because he was the smartest, the most reliable, and the most profitable. He had achieved what no one else had: supreme power without the spotlight, building an empire in the shadows. His name unknown to the general public, his face unrecognized on the street, while his influence stretched from the streets of Chicago to the budding neon glow of the Las Vegas Strip. He had perfected the art of being a ghost, a phantom CEO whose corporation dealt in fear, and whose bottom line was measured in absolute control. The pinnacle of Tony Accardo's power was not a throne in a back room, but a sprawling, custom-built estate in the affluent Chicago suburb of River Forest, a property that would become as legendary in mob lore as the man himself. This was not a gaudy display of wealth, but a fortress and a statement of intent, a physical manifestation of his corporate philosophy. Dubbed the River Forest Kiddieland by the few journalists who ever caught a glimpse of it, the estate was a wonder of security and secrecy, complete with an 8-foot-high electrified fence, a private golf putting green, and most famously a full-scale, operational merry-go-round and playground for his children. It was here, in this bizarre juxtaposition of familial bliss and paramilitary defense, that Accardo held court, conducting the business of the outfit while pushing his daughter on a swing. The 1950s represented the absolute zenith of his reign, a period where the Chicago outfit functioned with the smooth, ruthless efficiency of a Fortune 500 company, and Accardo was its undisputed, if unseen, chairman. His daily routine was a study in disciplined normalcy, a performance of such consistency that it became his greatest camouflage. He would rise early, read the newspapers not for the sports scores but for any mention of his associates or his enterprises, and then, looking every bit the respectable suburban patriarch, he would be driven to his office, often a nondescript restaurant or a social club in the city where he would hold quiet, untraceable meetings. The revenue streams he oversaw were vast and diversified, a portfolio of illegality that would be the envy of any criminal mastermind. The core remained the juice loan operation, a system of extortionate lending that trapped small business owners and gamblers in a cycle of perpetual debt, with weekly VIG payments flowing upwards like clockwork. The outfit's control over the unions, particularly the Teamsters, was his masterstroke. It gave him the power to paralyze the city with a strike, or more lucratively, to ensure there was no strike. For a price, it gave him access to the multi-billion-dollar pension fund, which he used as a personal bank to finance the building of the Las Vegas Strip, becoming a silent partner in casinos that would become household names. And then there was the grip on the city's vice, the countless bookmaking operations, the wire services that provided the racing odds, the brothels, and the nightclubs, all of them paying a street tax for the privilege of operating. Accardo's genius was in his organizational structure. He was a master of delegation, running the outfit through a clear military-style chain of command. Below him were the powerful street bosses, men like Sam Momo Giancana, who handled the day-to-day street operations and took the public heat. They were the visible tip of the spear, while Accardo remained the hidden hand guiding it. This structure insulated him perfectly. If a street boss was indicted, he could be sacrificed without the entire organization suffering. If a soldier was caught, he knew nothing of substance that could lead back to the top. The entire system operated on the twin engines of immense profit and the ever-present, ghostly threat of Joe Batters. It was during this period that the federal government, specifically the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, finally began to take systematic aim at organized crime. But Accardo was their ultimate paradox. He was their top hoodlum, the subject of intense surveillance and investigation, yet he was a ghost. They knew he was the boss. They could feel his influence in every corner of the city's underworld. But proving it was another matter entirely. Federal agents would trail him for days only to log him going to church, having lunch with his wife, or visiting a toy store. His phone, they discovered, was virtually unused for anything but family calls. He never wrote anything down. His meetings were conducted in moving cars, on golf courses, or in the open air of the Kiddieland playground, where electronic eavesdropping was nearly impossible. He was a living embodiment of the advice he would later famously give. Only the fish swim with their mouths open. He remained silent, watchful, and untouchable. The one time they managed to bring him in for questioning, he invoked the Fifth Amendment with a calm, almost bored demeanor, revealing nothing. He treated the FBI agents not as adversaries, but as a minor nuisance, a temporary inconvenience in his otherwise smoothly running operation. He watched with detached interest as the Kefauver committee hearings on organized crime captivated the nation. Seeing his rivals and subordinates squirm under the television lights, their faces and names becoming public spectacle, he ensured the Chicago outfit, and more importantly, he himself, remained largely in the background, a shadowy presence mentioned but never defined. This was the Accardo method in its purest form: power without presence, control without celebrity, wealth without ostentation. He had built an empire that was not just criminal but systemic, woven into the very fabric of the city's economy and politics, and he governed it from his suburban castle, a quiet, unassuming man pushing 60, whose most violent act in a decade may have been nothing more than a firm handshake, yet whose every whispered word could still command life and death. Yet even for a king who ruled from the deepest shadows, the relentless pressure of the modern world, with its wiretaps and its tenacious prosecutors, eventually began to constrict the old ways. The first significant crack in Tony Accardo's impregnable armor did not come from a rival's bullet or a traitor's testimony, but from the careless, flamboyant actions of his own subordinates, a generational conflict that pitted his philosophy of quiet power against the new breed's hunger for recognition. The primary offender was Sam Momo Giancana, the street boss Accardo had installed to manage the outfit's day-to-day operations. Giancana was everything Accardo despised: loud, volatile, and pathologically drawn to the spotlight. He cavorted with celebrities like Frank Sinatra and Phyllis McGuire, his face splashed across gossip columns, his every move chronicled by an eager press. To Accardo, this was not just a nuisance. It was a catastrophic breach of security, a direct repudiation of the core principles that had kept him out of prison for half a century. Giancana's high profile attracted an avalanche of FBI surveillance, and because Giancana reported to Accardo, that surveillance inevitably spilled over onto the boss himself. The delicate, invisible web Accardo had spent a lifetime weaving was now being lit up for all to see by the very man he had entrusted to protect it. This internal tension came to a head in a series of events that demonstrated both Accardo's enduring power and the increasing vulnerability of his position. The first major crisis was the Appalachian fiasco in 1957. when a national meeting of mob bosses in New York was raided by police, exposing the vast, interconnected network of organized crime to the American public. Accardo, characteristically, had not attended, once again avoiding direct association. But the fallout was national and severe, leading to a renewed and more determined federal crackdown. Then came the Kennedy assassination, a seismic event that sent shockwaves through the underworld. While the official story pinned the blame on Lee Harvey Oswald, persistent and credible theories, fueled by later congressional investigations, suggested possible mob involvement. The outfit, and Giancana in particular, had allegedly been involved in CIA plots to assassinate Fidel Castro, creating a tangled web of connections. More personally, the Kennedy administration, led by the president's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, had launched an unprecedented war on organized crime. This direct assault, combined with the long-standing belief that the mob had been instrumental in delivering Illinois for JFK in the 1960 election and had been betrayed, created a powerful motive for retaliation. While Accardo's direct involvement remains one of history's most debated and murky questions, the atmosphere of intense scrutiny and paranoia that followed the assassination made his discreet style of management more difficult than ever. The final straw was Giancana himself. His erratic behavior and the constant FBI tail he dragged around made him a liability. In a move of cold corporate efficiency, Accardo presided over a meeting of the outfit's board and voted to remove Giancana from his street boss position. There would be no murder, not immediately. It was a retirement, albeit a forced one, but it signaled a shift. The calm, orderly world Accardo had built was being threatened from within and without. The federal government was no longer just a persistent annoyance. It was now a sophisticated enemy armed with new laws like the RICO statute, which was specifically designed to attack the entire structure of criminal enterprises like the outfit, allowing prosecutors to go after the boss for the crimes of his underlings. Accardo watched as younger, brasher men seemed to forget the lessons of Al Capone, lessons written in blood and prison time. He began a gradual, strategic withdrawal, stepping back from the front lines of command, allowing others to take the visible, and therefore vulnerable, positions. He became an elder statesman, a consigliere, but his influence was no less potent. His word was still law, his approval still needed for any major hit or business venture. But he was now playing a more defensive game, fortifying his position, ensuring his personal safety and wealth, while the empire he had built so carefully began to face its greatest challenges. He spent more time at his winter home in Palm Springs, a luxurious retreat that also served as a strategic distance from the Chicago heat. Yet even in this semi-retirement, the old habits held. His security was meticulous, his conversations guarded, his life a continued performance of normalcy under an ever-darkening cloud. The golden age was ending, not with a bang, but with the slow, creeping inevitability of legal pressure and generational decay. And Tony Accardo, the master strategist, was perhaps the first to see the storm on the horizon, battening down the hatches around his own life and legacy, preparing for a final, protracted battle with a justice system that was finally learning how to fight back. The slow-burning fuse of federal ambition finally reached the heart of Tony Accardo's empire, not with a dramatic, singular explosion, but with a series of methodical, devastating legal blows that targeted the very foundation of his corporate-style crime. The instrument of this assault was the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO, a piece of legislation that was, in many ways, crafted specifically for men like him. For decades, Accardo had insulated himself by creating layers of deniability between himself and the street-level crimes that funded his wealth. He was the CEO, and under the old rules, a CEO could not be held liable for the unauthorized actions of a low-level employee. RICO changed everything. It allowed prosecutors to connect the dots, to paint a picture of a criminal enterprise where the boss, even if he never threw a punch or cashed a skim, was responsible for the collective crimes of his organization. The first major test of this new weapon against Accardo came in the form of the Strawman case in the early 1980s, a complex investigation into a massive nationwide stolen credit card and securities ring operated by the outfit. For the first time, the government believed it had a case that could directly link Accardo to the criminal activities of his subordinates. showing a pattern of racketeering that he oversaw and profited from. The trial was a media spectacle, the kind of attention Accardo had spent his entire life avoiding. He was now in his mid-70s, an elderly man in a suit, walking into a federal courthouse, the very scenario he had always considered the ultimate failure. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, wiretaps, though never of Accardo himself directly ordering a crime, financial records and the testimony of turncoats, soldiers who had broken the sacred code of omerta to save themselves. They painted a picture of a sophisticated corporate-structured organization with Accardo at its head. Yet, even in the lion's den, Accardo's discipline held. He sat through the proceedings with an impassive, almost regal calm, a silent monument to a dying era. His defense team, the best money could buy, meticulously picked apart the government's case, highlighting the lack of any direct recording of Accardo ordering a crime, the shaky credibility of the government's witnesses, who were themselves convicted criminals cutting deals, and the circumstantial nature of the evidence linking him to the specific Strawman operation. The trial was a brutal war of attrition, a battle between the new legal tools of the state and the old-world defenses of silence and obfuscation that Accardo had perfected. And in the end, the old world won, at least for a moment. The jury, after deliberation, returned a verdict of not guilty. Anthony Accardo walked out of the courthouse a free man, a stunning victory that echoed through the halls of both justice and the underworld. It was a testament to his lifelong methodology. He had been so careful, so utterly meticulous in avoiding any direct, provable link to illegal acts, that even the powerful RICO statute could not ensnare him. But the victory was Pyrrhic. The trial had drained him financially and, more importantly, psychologically. The constant scrutiny, the public exposure, the very act of having to defend his life in open court, was a profound humiliation and a warning. It proved that the government was getting closer, that their nets were growing stronger, and that his age was no longer a shield but a potential liability. The not guilty verdict was less a triumph and more a stay of execution. He retreated further into his shell after that, becoming even more reclusive, more paranoid, trusting an ever smaller circle of confidants. The world he commanded was also changing irrevocably. The old codes were breaking down. The fear of Joe Batters was fading, replaced by the more immediate fear of a 30-year RICO sentence. More and more soldiers, facing the rest of their lives in prison, chose to become government witnesses, to talk. The organization was rotting from within, betrayed by the very self-interest that Accardo had always understood and leveraged, but now could no longer control. He watched as his successors, men like Jackie Cerrone and Joseph Ayupa, were convicted in other RICO cases, their reigns cut short by lengthy prison terms. The outfit was being decapitated, not by violence but by indictments. Accardo, the master, had escaped this fate, but he was now the last of his kind, a dinosaur watching the meteor streak across the sky, knowing the world that had made him was coming to a definitive, unstoppable end. His power became more symbolic than operational, a legend that younger, less disciplined men paid lip service to, but did not truly fear in the way they had a generation before. He was a living relic, a reminder of a time when the mob was run like a business, but the business was now in receivership, its assets frozen and its executives in jail, and the chairman of the board, though still technically free, was presiding over a bankrupt empire. The final years of Tony Accardo's life were a study in the quiet, inexorable dissolution of power, a long, slow sunset that stood in stark contrast to the violent, bloody sunrises that had characterized his ascent. Having narrowly escaped the grasp of the federal government in the Strawman trial, he retreated almost entirely from the active management of the outfit, becoming a ghost in his own story, a whispered legend whose physical presence was felt less and less in the back rooms of Chicago. His world shrank to the confines of his two fortresses, the famed River Forest estate with its silent, watchful merry-go-round, and his winter home in Palm Springs, a sun-bleached palace of exile, where he could monitor the crumbling of his empire from a safe and comfortable distance. The outfit he had helped build into a sleek, corporate machine was now a shadow of its former self, ravaged by RICO indictments, internal betrayals, and a changing America, where the traditional structures of organized crime were being supplanted by more decentralized transnational gangs. The men who now rose to positions of authority lacked his strategic patience and his profound understanding of the relationship between visibility and vulnerability. They were smaller, greedier, and ultimately less effective. Their tenures often measured not in decades of stable profit, but in the few short years before a lengthy prison sentence. Accardo watched this decay not with rage but with a weary philosophical resignation. He had outlived his era. He spent his days in a routine of monastic simplicity, a king without a kingdom. His primary concerns shifting from orchestrating multi-million-dollar schemes to managing his vast, legally obscured wealth and ensuring his personal safety. He would still take meetings, but they were fewer and farther between. And always with the utmost caution, his paranoia now a fully justified and necessary life preserver in a sea of potential informants. The man who had once commanded armies of enforcers now relied on a small, trusted cadre of old-timers, men whose loyalty was as much to the memory of what he represented as it was to the man himself. His health, once as robust as his will, began its inevitable decline. The pressures of a lifetime spent living in a state of constant low-grade warfare, the psychological toll of countless secrets, and the weight of untold sins began to manifest in the frailties of an aging body. He became a more frequent visitor to doctors, always under assumed names, his medical records as guarded as his criminal history. Yet even in this twilight his mind remained sharp, his memory a perfect, unassailable archive of every deal, every betrayal, every face that had crossed his path. He could recall the exact percentage of a skim from a Las Vegas casino in 1965, with the same clarity as he could the name of a long-dead rival from the Capone days. This mental fortitude was his last remaining fortress, and it remained impregnable. He saw the obituaries of his contemporaries, men like Paul Ricca and Murray Humphreys who had passed from natural causes, and he saw the headlines of others like Sam Giancana, who was brutally murdered in his own basement just before he was scheduled to testify before a Senate committee, a hit that many in the know believed had Accardo's tacit, if not direct approval, a final housekeeping measure to silence a loose end from a bygone era. The message was clear. The rules still applied even in retirement. The code of omerta was not dead as long as he drew breath. This period was also marked by a poignant and, for Accardo, likely painful, focus on his family. His children were now adults, raised in the opulent shadow of his secret life, and he made concerted efforts to insulate them, to steer them toward legitimate careers and away from the temptation of the empire he had built. He was determined that his legacy would not be a curse passed down to another generation. He became a grandfather, and those who knew him in these final years spoke of a softer, more reflective man, though the core of steel was always present, the ever-watchful eyes missing nothing. He would spend hours in the quiet of his home, surrounded by the trappings of his immense wealth, fine art, custom-made furniture, a wine cellar that was the envy of connoisseurs. Yet the most prominent feature was always the security system, a constant humming reminder that the world outside was still a threat. The empire was dying, but the enemies it had made were very much alive. The federal surveillance never entirely ceased. It simply became less intense, a background noise to his life, a final lingering acknowledgement of his historical significance. He was a living museum piece, the last connection to a vanished world of bootleggers and syndicates, and the FBI in a way was his final persistent biographer, documenting the end of a story they had tried and failed to write for 50 years. He had become a paradox, a free man who lived like a prisoner in his own homes, a multimillionaire who could never truly enjoy his wealth without looking over his shoulder, a legendary power broker whose influence had dwindled to a mere echo. The great game was over, and though he had not been defeated on the board itself had been taken away, leaving him alone with his memories and the grim satisfaction of knowing that he had, against all odds, never been conquered by the law he had spent a lifetime flouting. The end, when it finally came for Anthony Accardo, was as meticulously managed and devoid of external drama as the man himself had always strived to be. A quiet conclusion to a life of orchestrated chaos. It was not a hail of bullets on a street corner, nor was it the clang of a prison cell door slamming shut for the final time. It was the simple, inevitable failure of an aging heart in the plush, silent confines of his own bedroom. The date was May 22, 1992. He was 86 years old. The news of his death sent ripples through two parallel worlds. In the underworld, it was received as the passing of a deity, the final closing of the book on the golden age of organized crime, a moment of sober reflection for the few old-timers who remembered what true power and discipline looked like. In the legitimate world, it was a curious footnote, the death of a mysterious, wealthy businessman who had, according to persistent rumors, been a very significant figure in Chicago's storied criminal past. There was no massive theatrical funeral procession filled with black Cadillacs and weeping mobsters, the kind that had marked the passing of his more flamboyant predecessors. True to form, his farewell was a private family affair service, a final exercise in staying out of the spotlight. He was buried in a costly but not ostentatious mausoleum in Queen of Heaven's Cemetery, a Catholic burial ground, his final resting place as secure and unassuming as his life had tried to be. The irony of his end was profound and inescapable. The man known as Joe Batters, whose nickname was born from a reputation for brutal, visceral violence, had died of natural causes in his own bed, a feat so statistically improbable in his chosen profession that it stands as his most remarkable achievement. He had outlived virtually all of his contemporaries, his rivals, his subordinates, and even the FBI agents who had dedicated their careers to putting him away. In the immediate aftermath of his death, the vacuum he left behind was not filled by another titan of his caliber, because there were none left. The Chicago outfit, already a weakened and fractured entity, entered its final, irrevocable decline, becoming a pale imitation of the corporate colossus he had once commanded. It splintered into competing, less sophisticated factions, more concerned with short-term street-level gains than with the long-term systemic infiltration that had been the hallmark of the Accardo Rica era. The institutional knowledge, the political connections, the sheer operational genius that he embodied, died with him. His legacy, therefore, is a complex and contradictory tapestry, a subject of endless fascination for historians and criminologists alike. On one hand, he was a monster, a ruthless criminal who presided over an empire built on fear, extortion, murder, and the corruption of public institutions. He was directly or indirectly responsible for untold human misery, for shattered lives and broken families, for a corrosion of the social fabric that stretched from the slums of Chicago to the halls of power. There is no glorifying this reality. Yet, on the other hand, he was a criminal visionary, a master strategist whose understanding of power dynamics, public relations, and organizational management was so profound that it could be studied in business schools if its source were not so tainted. He was the architect of the modern corporate mob, the first to fully understand that the most effective criminal is not the one who makes the front page, but the one who operates the printing press from the shadows. He demonstrated that ultimate power lies not in the frequency of violence, but in the omnipresent threat of it, carefully and selectively deployed. His life is a dark lesson in the mechanics of control, a case study in how to build and maintain an illicit enterprise with the efficiency and cold calculation of a Fortune 500 company. The millions of dollars he amassed, much of which remains hidden or laundered into legitimate assets to this day, is a testament to his financial acumen, his unwavering commitment to his family, however twisted the means of providing for them, adds a deeply human, if complicating, layer to his story. He was a man of his word in a world where a man's word was often the only contract that mattered, and his loyalty, once given, was steadfast, a quality that inspired fierce devotion in his inner circle. But ultimately, the story of Tony Accardo is a tragedy on a grand scale, the tale of a brilliant mind and formidable will that was entirely devoted to an enterprise of evil. He chose a path of predation rather than creation, of fear rather than respect, of shadows rather than light. He won his lifelong battle with the justice system, only to lose the war for his own soul, becoming a prisoner of his own success. Living out his final years in a gilded cage of his own making, watching the empire he sacrificed his integrity for slowly crumble to dust around him. He proved that it was possible to beat the system, but in doing so, he also proved that such a victory is hollow, a lifetime of paranoia and isolation purchased with blood money. The legend of Tony Accardo endures not as a hero but as a warning, and as the ultimate benchmark of criminal efficiency, a ghost whose methods are still whispered about, but whose like we will almost certainly never see again. To truly understand the monolithic figure of Tony Accardo, One must venture beyond the broad strokes of his reign and delve into the granular details of his methodology, the very DNA of his operational code that separated him from every other gangster of his century. It was a code built not on emotion but on a cold, almost mathematical calculus of risk and reward. A system where every action, every word, and every relationship was weighed for its long-term strategic value. At the heart of this system was his legendary, almost pathological aversion to direct communication about illicit affairs. While other mobsters saw wiretaps as an occupational hazard, Accardo treated them as the primary enemy, structuring his entire life around their defeat. He conducted his most sensitive meetings outdoors, on golf courses during a long walk between holes, or while fishing on a quiet lake, where directional microphones were useless and the vastness of the open air swallowed their words. When a meeting indoors was unavoidable, he would famously turn on multiple radios or televisions to different stations, creating a cacophony of static and noise that rendered any hidden recording device futile. He never, under any circumstances, discussed business on the telephone, understanding that the phone was a direct pipeline for the FBI. This was not mere paranoia. It was a disciplined, professional practice that he maintained without exception for over 60 years. His instructions were often delivered through a complex system of metaphors and unspoken understandings. An order for a murder might be phrased as a need to take care of a problem, or to make sure someone never bothers us again, followed by a meaningful, sustained silence that conveyed the ultimate meaning with chilling clarity. He managed the outfit's vast financial empire with the same meticulous care. He understood the power of cash, but he also understood that large, unexplained sums of cash were a liability. He pioneered money laundering techniques long before the term entered the public lexicon, funneling millions through a web of legitimate front businesses that he controlled. These weren't just shell companies. Many were actual profitable enterprises like the vending machine and jukebox operations, which provided a perfect, cash-heavy cover for the outfit's illicit profits. He invested heavily in real estate, both commercial and residential, building a portfolio of assets that appreciated in value and provided a veneer of legitimate wealth. His personal spending was equally calculated. He lived well, but he avoided the gaudy displays of affluence that brought down his predecessors. He drove expensive but not flashy cars. He wore impeccably tailored suits, but they were conservative and did not draw attention. His home, while a fortress, was decorated with taste and a quiet elegance, not the garish opulence of a newly rich thug. This consistent presentation as a successful, respectable businessman was his masterstroke. It disarmed suspicion and made the idea of him as a vicious mob boss seem implausible to the uninitiated. His management of people was another key to his longevity. He ruled not through constant terror, but through the strategic and awe-inspiring application of it. His reputation from the Joe Batters era preceded him, a foundational myth that did all the intimidating for him, allowing the older, calmer Accardo to rarely even raise his voice. He was known to be fair in his own dark way. If a soldier performed a job well, he was rewarded handsomely. Loyalty was incentivized with wealth and status, but disloyalty, or even gross incompetence, was met with a swift and terrifying finality that was so absolute it served as a lesson for years. He understood that to maintain morale and efficiency, his organization had to be profitable for everyone involved, from the lowliest street collector to the highest-ranking captain. This created a powerful ecosystem of self-interest that reinforced the structure he had built. He also possessed an uncanny ability to read character, to sense ambition, weakness, or treachery in a man long before it surfaced. This allowed him to manage the volatile personalities within his organization, pitting ambitious underlings against each other just enough to keep them in check, but never enough to spark a civil war that would threaten the overall enterprise. He saw the outfit not as a family but as a corporation, and he was its chief executive officer, making personnel decisions based on what was best for the bottom line and the long-term stability of the company. This detached corporate perspective is what allowed him to calmly order the murder of a longtime associate, if that associate became a liability, viewing it not as a personal betrayal, but as a necessary business decision, a cost of doing business in his particular industry. It was this chilling, almost sociopathic detachment, combined with his brilliant tactical mind, that formed the core of his success. He was not a hot-headed killer. He was a cold-blooded strategist for whom violence was simply one tool in a vast arsenal, and often the last one to be used. He thought in terms of decades, not days, always playing the long game, always positioning himself and his organization for a future that only he could see. This profound patience, this willingness to forego short-term glory for long-term security, is what truly defined him, and what ultimately ensured that he would die an old man in his bed, a free and fabulously wealthy king, while the empires of his more impulsive rivals lay in ruins around him. His life stands as a dark testament to the power of discipline over passion, of strategy over impulse, and of silence over boastfulness, a manual for the perfect criminal enterprise written in the blood and shadows of 20th century America. The financial empire that Tony Accardo built and so meticulously managed was a sprawling, hydra-headed entity, a masterpiece of illicit economics that penetrated the very marrow of American commerce. And its scale and sophistication remain almost incomprehensible even today. To view the Chicago outfit under his guidance as merely a collection of thugs running protection rackets is to profoundly misunderstand its nature. It was, in effect, a shadowy, unregulated conglomerate with a diversified portfolio that would be the envy of any Wall Street investment firm. The lifeblood of this empire was cash, a relentless, flowing river of untaxed, unaccounted-for currency that poured in from every corner of the city and beyond. At the most fundamental level were the neighborhood taxes, the street tax paid by every bookmaker, numbers runner, and illicit gambling den for the privilege of operating without interference, a system so efficient it functioned like a municipal government collecting fees. Then came the juice loans, a brutal form of usury where desperate businessmen or gamblers in debt were lent money at exorbitant interest rates, often 10% per week. A crushing burden that ensured they would be perpetual servants to the outfit, working only to pay off the ever-mounting vig. But Accardo's genius lay in his understanding that true power and permanence came from moving up the economic food chain, from street-level extortion to corporate-level infiltration. His most brilliant maneuver was the systematic takeover of labor unions, most famously the Teamsters, through a combination of strategic violence, cunning, and corruption. By installing loyalists in key union positions, the outfit gained control over massive pension funds, which they then loaned to themselves at favorable rates to finance their expansion into Las Vegas. They became the silent partners, the hidden interests in casinos like the Stardust, the Desert Inn, and the Riviera, siphoning off millions through a complex process known as the skim, where cash was taken from the counting rooms before it was ever officially logged, a ghost revenue stream that flowed directly from the casino vaults into the pockets of Accardo and his associates back in Chicago. This money was then laundered through a labyrinth of legitimate-seeming businesses that Accardo controlled or influenced. The jukebox and vending machine industry, through the Music Operators of America, was a perfect front. It was a cash-based business that operated in thousands of locations, making it nearly impossible for auditors to track the true source of revenue. He had interests in trucking companies, waste management, liquor distribution, and construction, all industries susceptible to union pressure and backdoor deals. The outfit could ensure labor peace for a construction project for a price, or they could guarantee a lucrative city contract would go to a specific company in return for a silent partnership. This created a self-perpetuating cycle of wealth and power. The illicit cash from gambling and loans was used to corrupt unions. The corrupted unions provided leverage over legitimate industries, and the profits from those legitimate industries provided a clean facade for the dirty money, and further funds for corruption and expansion. Accardo's personal role in this vast machine was that of the ultimate chief financial officer. He may not have known the name of every street-level collector, but he knew the precise percentage of the skim from each Las Vegas casino, the weekly take from the major bookmaking operations, and the cash flow from his various front businesses. He presided over meetings where the financial health of the entire organization was reviewed with the seriousness of a corporate board, allocating resources, approving major investments, and settling disputes over territory and profit shares. His own wealth was conservatively estimated to be in the hundreds of millions, yet it was so expertly hidden, dispersed across shell corporations, offshore accounts, and real estate holdings, that even after his death the full extent remains a mystery. He lived comfortably, but he understood that displaying that wealth was a strategic error. This financial architecture was his lasting legacy, A blueprint for turning organized crime from a parasitic activity into a symbiotic one, weaving its tendrils so deeply into the legitimate economy that extracting it became and remains nearly impossible. The money he stole, the businesses he corrupted, and the financial systems he manipulated are a permanent, if invisible, scar on the economic history of the United States, a testament to the fact that the most dangerous criminals are not those who rob banks but those who, like Tony Accardo, quietly, efficiently, and brilliantly become the bank. Beyond the cold calculus of finance and the strategic silence that defined his professional life, there existed another, more enigmatic layer to Tony Accardo, a personal world shrouded in as much mystery as his criminal enterprises, a dimension of the man that reveals the profound and irreconcilable contradictions at the heart of his character. To his family, he was not Joe Batters or the chairman of the outfit. He was simply Tony, a devoted husband to his wife Clarice and a doting father to his children. This was not merely a role he played. By all accounts, it was a deeply felt and fiercely protected part of his identity. He built the legendary Kiddieland in his backyard, not as a cynical public relations ploy, but as a genuine sanctuary for his children, a magical world where the grim realities of his other life could not intrude. He was present at school events. He enforced strict curfews and he demanded good grades, aspiring for his offspring to have the legitimate, respectable lives that his own choices had forever made impossible for himself. He was a man of simple, almost rustic tastes when at home. He loved to cook, often preparing large Italian feasts for his family, and he found genuine solace in working with his hands in his garden, a quiet, earthy pursuit that stood in stark contrast to the abstract, blood-soaked dealings of his work. This dichotomy was the central paradox of his existence, the capacity for profound domestic tenderness coexisting with an absolute ruthlessness in business. He could, in the same day, gently console a crying child and coldly authorize the execution of a business rival, compartmentalizing his life with a psychological fortitude that is both fascinating and terrifying. This extended to his personal code of ethics, a twisted sense of honor that governed his actions within the underworld. He was known to be a man of his word. If Tony Accardo gave you his promise, you could consider it binding, a quality that earned him immense respect and trust among his peers. He despised unnecessary brutality. Violence, in his worldview, was a tool, not a pastime, and it was to be used with precision and only when all other options had been exhausted. He looked down upon drug dealing, not out of any moral compunction, but because he saw it as a messy, unpredictable, and ultimately self-destructive enterprise that brought unwanted heat from federal authorities and corrupted the discipline of his organization. This stance, however, was likely as much about business pragmatism as it was about any personal code, a recognition that addicts were unreliable and that the narcotics trade was a vortex that consumed all who entered it. His relationships with other powerful figures were complex and layered. His partnership with Paul the waiter Rica was one of the most successful and enduring in criminal history, a meeting of two complementary minds, Rica, the sophisticated political fixer, and Accardo, the strategic operations manager. Together, they formed a balanced leadership that guided the outfit through its most prosperous and stable decades. Yet, for all his power, he had few true friends. How could he? Trust was the ultimate luxury in his world, and it was doled out in minuscule, carefully measured portions. His life was one of profound isolation. A king trapped within the walls of his own palace, surrounded by sycophants, employees, and potential enemies, but never by equals with whom he could truly let down his guard. The immense pressure of maintaining this double life for over half a century is almost impossible to fathom. The constant grinding vigilance required to ensure that the mask never slipped, that no hint of the monster ever intruded upon the family man, and that no trace of the family man ever softened the monster. This internal schism must have been a heavy burden, a source of a deep, unspoken loneliness that no amount of wealth or power could ever alleviate. He was a man forever divided, living two mutually exclusive lives in a single body, a testament to the immense human cost of the path he chose. The family he loved so dearly lived perpetually in the long shadow of his other life, beneficiaries of his illicit wealth but also prisoners of his notoriety, forced to navigate a world where their last name was both a shield and a target. In this light, Tony Accardo emerges not as a one-dimensional villain, but as a profoundly tragic figure, A man of immense talent and discipline who channeled all his energies into a destructive enterprise, achieving a form of dark immortality, but sacrificing any chance at genuine peace or wholeness in the process. He succeeded in everything he set out to do, only to discover that the ultimate price of his success was his own soul, leaving behind a legacy of a perfectly managed life that was, in its deepest essence, a beautifully constructed and utterly empty shell.
The intricate and unbreakable web of loyalty, fear, and mutual self-interest that Tony Accardo wove around himself did not exist in a vacuum. It was constantly tested, probed, and assailed by the forces of law and order, leading to a series of legendary confrontations with the justice system that further cemented his reputation as the untouchable Godfather. The most significant of these early battles was the Kefauver Committee hearings in 1950, a nationwide televised investigation into organized crime that brought the grim reality of the American underworld into the living rooms of millions. While flashier mobsters from New York and elsewhere squirmed under the hot lights and aggressive questioning, Accardo's performance was a masterclass in stoic defiance. He was called to testify, and for days, he faced the senators, but he revealed nothing. He invoked the Fifth Amendment protection against self-incrimination over 100 times, his face a mask of impassive calm, his voice a steady, quiet refusal. He did not bluster, he did not get angry, he did not try to outsmart his interrogators with clever wordplay. He simply refused to play the game at all. This was a calculated strategy, one that demonstrated his profound understanding of the new medium of television. He knew the camera was his real interrogator, and he ensured that the image it broadcast to America was not of a snarling gangster, but of a respectable, well-dressed businessman who was being harassed by an overreaching government. This public display of impenetrability only deepened the mystery around him and reinforced his power within the outfit. He was the man even the United States Senate could not crack. This set the pattern for decades of legal encounters. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, eventually made organized crime a priority, and Accardo became their #1 target. They assigned teams of agents to follow him, they placed wiretaps on the phones of his associates, they planted bugs in his favorite meeting places, and they compiled a file on him that grew to tens of thousands of pages. Yet, for all their efforts, they could never secure the one thing they needed: direct, admissible evidence of Tony Accardo ordering a crime or directly participating in one. The agents who trailed him would spend entire shifts watching him do nothing more exciting than get a haircut, buy a newspaper, or have a long, inaudible conversation while walking through a park. The wiretaps yielded nothing but frustrating silence or mundane family chatter. He was a ghost, a phantom who left no fingerprints on his own empire. The one time they managed to get a conviction on a minor tax charge in the 1960s, it was swiftly overturned on appeal, a mere hiccup in his otherwise spotless legal record. This cat-and-mouse game with the FBI defined his later years, a slow, grinding war of attrition where the government threw immense resources at a target that seemed to absorb all their energy without yielding an inch. He treated the constant surveillance not as a persecution, but as a professional hazard, an occupational tax that had to be managed with the same discipline as any other aspect of his business. He knew the agents by their first names, he would sometimes wave to them as he drove by, and he even occasionally bought them coffee on a cold day, a gesture that was both strangely humane and a subtle, psychological power play, reminding them that he was a human being, not just a file number, and that he was so unthreatened by their presence that he could afford to be courteous. This long, frustrating stalemate finally seemed to break with the advent of the RICO statute and the subsequent Strawman trial in the 1980s, which we have already chronicled, but even that ultimate legal weapon, designed to ensnare just such a figure as he, ultimately failed to hold him. The not guilty verdict was a stunning vindication of his lifelong methods, a final, definitive proof that his system of silence, layers of insulation, and corporate structure worked. It was the crowning achievement of his criminal career, more significant than any single $1 million score, because it was a victory over the full might of the United States government. When he walked out of that courtroom a free man, it was the ultimate expression of his philosophy, that the most powerful criminal is not the one who commits the most crimes, but the one who possesses the genius to ensure that they can never be proven. His battles with the law are a crucial chapter in his story, not because he was ever truly defeated by them, but because they provide the clearest window into the operational genius of the man. He didn't just evade justice, he outthought it, he outplanned it, and he outlasted it, turning the entire justice system into his most formidable and persistent adversary, and in the end, after a 50-year war, he was the one who was left standing, a testament to the terrifying efficiency of a criminal mind devoted entirely to the art of remaining free. As the 1980s bled into the final years of his life, Tony Accardo's world, once so expansive and tightly controlled, began to shrink and soften at the edges, not with the dramatic collapse of an empire, but with the quiet, inevitable fading of a man who had simply grown old in a young person's game. The stunning acquittal in the Strawman case, while a monumental legal victory, had also served as a stark punctuation mark on his active career. It was the last great battle he would fight, and the energy required to wage it had taken a permanent toll. He retreated further into the roles of elder statesman and historical artifact, a living library of the outfit's secrets and strategies, but his direct involvement in the day-to-day machinations of the organization became increasingly rare. The new generation of mobsters, men who had come of age in the era of RICO and rampant informants, viewed him with a distant, almost mythological reverence, but they lacked the patience or the discipline to seek his counsel in any meaningful way. The corporate model he had perfected was being dismantled, replaced by a more desperate, short-sighted scramble for dwindling profits. The steady, massive river of cash from the Las Vegas skim had dried up after federal prosecutions exposed the scheme, and the outfit's iron grip on unions and legitimate industries was being pried loose by relentless federal investigations and a changing economy. Accardo watched this decay from a distance, from the sun-drenched patios of his Palm Springs home or the familiar, guarded rooms of his River Forest estate, with a sense of resignation that likely bordered on sorrow. The empire he had spent a lifetime building was being managed by caretakers who did not understand its foundation, and it was crumbling into irrelevance. His primary concerns shifted from orchestrating multi-million-dollar deals to managing his vast, hidden fortune and preserving his health. The formidable physical presence that had earned him the name, Joe Batters, was now bowed by age. His steps were slower, his once imposing frame grew thinner, and the sharp, penetrating gaze that could silence a room with a glance was now often clouded with the fatigue of a man carrying the weight of his long and heavy history. Yet, his mind remained a fortress, his memory a perfect, uncorrupted record of every deal, every face, every betrayal, and every secret burial ground from the past 60 years. He became a repository of stories that would never be told, a keeper of truths that would die with him. This period was marked by a series of personal losses that further isolated him, severing his last connections to the world he had helped create. His old partners, the men who had formed the original brain trust of the modern outfit, were all gone: Paul Ricca, Murray Humphreys, even the troublesome Sam Giancana, whose murder in 1975 had solved one problem but also erased a living link to the Capone era. With each passing, Accardo became more alone, the last surviving pillar of a temple that was already in ruins. His family became his entire universe, the one sphere where he could truly let down his guard. He doted on his grandchildren, in whom he saw a chance for a fresh start, a legacy untainted by his life's work. He spent long afternoons with them in the Kiddieland that was now mostly silent, a poignant symbol of a time when his power was at its peak and his family was young. The merry-go-round, once a brilliant piece of misdirection and a symbol of his unique brand of power, was now just a relic, a playground for a new generation he hoped would never know the world he came from. The constant, humming presence of federal surveillance diminished, not because the FBI had given up, but because they, too, recognized that the story was nearing its end. The teams of agents were reassigned to younger, more active targets. The wiretaps were discontinued. The war was over, and both sides seemed to understand that the final outcome was a draw. The government had never put him in prison, and he had never been able to fully pass on his invincible system to a successor. He existed in a state of quiet suspension, a legend living out his days in a comfortable, heavily fortified retirement, his immense wealth ensuring every physical comfort but unable to buy the one thing he may have truly craved in his final years: peace. The ghosts of his past, the men he had ordered killed, the lives he had ruined, the blood that had been spilled to build his fortune, these were the silent companions of his old age. He had achieved the impossible. He had won the game of organized crime, but the victory was hollow, leaving him as the last king of a deserted kingdom, sitting on a throne of gold and memories, waiting for the curtain to fall on a performance that had lasted for nearly a century. The world outside was changing, moving on, forgetting the name Tony Accardo, but inside his homes, time seemed to have stopped, preserving him like a relic in a museum of his own making, a monument to a bygone era of power, fear, and an unwavering, disciplined silence that ultimately outlasted everyone and everything, except, perhaps, for his own conscience. The physical and psychological fortress that was Tony Accardo, a structure built over 8 decades with unimaginable discipline and will, finally began to show irreversible signs of structural failure as the 1990s dawned. The decline was not sudden, but a gradual, relentless erosion, a slow-motion surrender to the simple, undeniable biology of age. The man who had once commanded the absolute fear and respect of an entire city now navigated his own homes with the careful, measured steps of the elderly, his world shrinking to the distance between his bedroom, his favorite armchair, and the dining table. The robust health that had been a point of pride, a symbol of his superiority over his weaker, more dissolute rivals, began to betray him. The specifics of his final ailments remain, like much of his life, shrouded in secrecy, but the cumulative toll of a life lived under constant, low-grade siege, the unyielding pressure, the sleepless nights spent listening for sounds that didn't belong, the psychological weight of countless secrets, had undoubtedly worn his body down from the inside. He consulted doctors, of course, the best that his immense wealth could secure, but these visits were conducted with the same clandestine tradecraft that had defined his business meetings, using assumed names and private arrangements to keep his medical condition one more secret from the outside world. Even in his frailty, the old habits held. The paranoia was so deeply ingrained it had become a part of his nervous system. He could no longer manage the intricate details of his financial empire, leaving the maintenance of his fortune to a trusted few, lawyers and accountants who operated with limited power of attorney, ensuring the river of wealth continued to flow even as its source weakened. The reports from the few outsiders who saw him in these final years described a figure who was a mere echo of the formidable Joe Batters. The sharp, assessing eyes were now often distant, looking not at the person in front of him, but inward, at the long, dark corridor of his past. The firm, decisive voice was softer, sometimes trailing off into silence. He spent hours in quiet contemplation, surrounded by the opulent, tasteful furnishings of his homes, the very picture of a successful retired executive, yet the content of his thoughts during those long, silent hours is a matter of profound speculation. Did he reflect on the lives he had taken, the families he had destroyed, the corruption he had seeded into the heart of his city? Or did he, with the cold pragmatism that had always guided him, simply review his life as a business venture, tallying the profits and losses, and concluding that, on balance, he had come out decisively ahead? There were likely moments of both. He was a complex man, capable of genuine love for his family and cold-blooded murder in the same soul, and the end of life has a way of forcing a final accounting, a reconciliation of these warring halves. He saw the world he was leaving behind, a world where the outfit was a hollow shell, its power broken by RICO and its honor destroyed by informants. The new breed of criminal was on the rise, more chaotic, less bound by any code, dealing in drugs he despised and operating in a digital landscape he could never comprehend. He was becoming a relic, a story told by old men, his method seen as antiquated as the speakeasies of his youth. This knowledge, that his life's work was dissolving into irrelevance, must have been a particularly bitter pill to swallow for a man who had always thought in terms of legacy and permanence. The very silence he had cultivated so carefully was now, in his final days, perhaps his greatest burden. There was no one left with whom he could share the full truth of his experiences, no one who could truly understand the weight of the crown he had worn. He was alone with his memories, a solitary king in a castle of his own making, awaiting the one adversary he could not outsmart, could not corrupt, and could not intimidate. The federal government had given up its active pursuit, but a more final justice was now approaching, step by slow, inevitable step. The elaborate security systems, the electrified fences, the trusted bodyguards, all were now useless against this final, internal enemy. The fortress was falling from within, and Tony Accardo, the man who had defied every external threat for nearly 90 years, was finally, quietly, preparing to surrender. The final, quiet chapter in the life of Anthony Accardo began in the spring of 1992, a season of renewal that for him signaled only an ending. He was 86 years old, and the formidable engine of his body, which had run with such relentless efficiency for so long, was finally shutting down, its systems failing one by one in a slow, deliberate sequence. He spent his last days not in a sterile hospital room surrounded by beeping machines and unfamiliar faces, but in the carefully controlled, deeply familiar environment of his own home, most likely in River Forest, surrounded by the symbols of the dual life he had led, the family photographs, the fine art, the quiet opulence, and the ever-present, unspoken tension of a lifetime spent looking over his shoulder. His immediate family, his wife Clarice, his children, and his grandchildren, would have been his final companions, the only people granted access to the innermost sanctum in these most private of hours. One can imagine the scene: hushed voices, the soft closing of doors, a pervasive sense of solemn waiting. The man in the bed was a far cry from the legend. The power that had once seemed to radiate from him had now receded, leaving behind a fragile vessel, a testament to the ultimate democracy of human mortality. It is in these final, quiet moments that the most profound questions about his life arise. What thoughts occupied his mind as he lay there, between the world he was leaving and the unknown he was approaching? Was there regret? Was there fear? Or was there, as his lifelong demeanor would suggest, a calm, stoic acceptance, a final assessment that he had played his hand as well as it could possibly have been played and had no apologies to offer to anyone, divine or mortal? Given his Catholic upbringing, one wonders if he sought last rites from a priest, a final absolution for a lifetime of sin, or if he faced the end relying solely on his own immense, internal fortitude, the same force that had carried him through 100 crises. There were no deathbed confessions, no startling revelations whispered to a loved one or a reporter. Tony Accardo maintained his code of silence until his very last breath, taking with him to the grave the full, unvarnished truth of his reign, the locations of buried bodies, the names of corrupted officials, the precise details of countless unsolved crimes. His death, like his life, was a masterclass in control and denial of access to his enemies. He ensured that the final, definitive history of the Chicago outfit could never be written because its chief architect would never testify. On May 22, 1992, the long, complex, and contradictory journey of Anthony Accardo came to an end. The cause was officially listed as heart failure, a simple, clinical term for the cessation of a force that had shaped the criminal history of an American century. The news was communicated to the world not with a sensational press conference from law enforcement, but through a quiet, formal death notice, the kind placed by any grieving family. Yet, the ripple effects were immediate and profound. In the underworld, it was the equivalent of a king's passing. The last living tether to the era of Al Capone, the man who had personally bridged the gap between the wild bootlegging days of the 1920s and the corporate corruption of the late 20th century, was gone. For the few remaining old-timers, it was a moment of deep reflection and the closing of a final door. For the FBI and federal prosecutors, it was a moment of profound, if unspoken, frustration. They had spent millions of dollars and countless man-hours trying to build a case against him, and in the end, he had cheated them of their prize, escaping earthly judgment entirely. He had won his freedom not through a legal loophole, but through the simple, unassailable fact of his own expiration. The obituaries that appeared in newspapers across the country struggled to capture the essence of the man, reduced to labels like alleged crime boss and reputed kingpin, terms he had spent his entire life rendering legally accurate yet functionally inadequate. They listed his nicknames, his associations, the broad strokes of his criminal empire, but they could not capture the chilling efficiency, the psychological depth, or the sheer, unprecedented success of his criminal career. His funeral, true to form, was a private, family-only affair, a final act of disappearing from the public eye. There was no massive procession of black limousines, no phalanx of grieving mobsters giving one last salute, no theatrical display of underworld grief. It was a quiet, dignified, and intensely private ceremony, exactly as he would have wanted it. He was laid to rest in an imposing mausoleum in Queen of Heaven Cemetery, a final, solid, and impenetrable structure, a reflection of the man himself. The tomb, like his life, was secure, private, and designed to keep the secrets within forever locked away from prying eyes. The death of Tony Accardo was not just the death of a man, it was the death of an archetype, the final page in the story of a certain kind of American criminal, the corporate boss who understood that the most effective power is the power that is never seen, never heard, and never, ever proven in a court of law. He passed from the world as he had lived in it, on his own terms, surrounded by his family, and leaving behind a mystery that would forever remain unsolved. In the immediate aftermath of Tony Accardo's death, a strange and pervasive silence seemed to fall over the world he had once dominated, a quiet that was far more telling than any explosion of violence or public mourning could ever have been. The Chicago outfit, already a ghost of its former self, did not rally or fracture in a power struggle, it simply continued its slow, inexorable fade into irrelevance, like a machine whose primary engine had been permanently removed, leaving the remaining parts to whir and clatter until they, too, ran out of momentum. There was no heir apparent of his caliber, no strategic mastermind waiting in the wings to pick up the mantle and restore the organization to its former corporate glory. The men who remained were administrators of a dying estate, managers of dwindling assets, their ambitions limited to squeezing the last few drops of profit from neighborhood sports betting and residual union corruption before the final curtain fell. The federal authorities, who had dedicated entire divisions to monitoring his every move, now found themselves without their white whale. The massive surveillance files were closed, stamped, and sent to archives, becoming historical documents rather than active investigations. For the city of Chicago, it was the end of an era in the most literal sense, the last living connection to the mythic age of Capone, the last boss who could truly be called a Godfather, was gone, and with him passed a certain kind of fear, a deeply ingrained, systemic dread that had been a part of the city's fabric for generations. The void he left behind was not filled by another criminal empire, but by a new, more fragmented landscape of street gangs and decentralized criminal enterprises that lacked the discipline, the structure, and the overarching vision that had characterized the outfit at its peak. The story of his legacy, however, was just beginning to be written in the years that followed, and it is a legacy of profound and enduring contradiction. On one hand, he is remembered as the most successful gangster in American history, the gold standard for criminal efficiency. His ability to operate for over 6 decades at the very pinnacle of organized crime without ever spending a night in jail is an achievement that stands alone, a record of impunity that seems almost supernatural in its perfection. He is studied by criminologists and law enforcement agencies around the world as the architect of the modern corporate mob, a model of how to insulate leadership through layers of management and strict operational security. His name is spoken in hushed, almost reverent tones in the annals of true crime, the benchmark against which all other crime lords are measured and found wanting. Yet, on the other hand, his legacy is also one of profound emptiness and a cautionary tale about the ultimate price of such a life. What did he truly win? He died a free man, but he lived as a prisoner of his own paranoia, trapped in a gilded cage of his own construction, unable to form genuine connections outside of his immediate family, forced to view every person he met as a potential threat or a usable asset. He amassed a fortune, but he could never truly enjoy it in the open, could never bask in the admiration or respect of the legitimate world. He built an empire, but he watched it crumble into dust before his eyes, unable to stop the decay or to pass on his wisdom to a generation that no longer valued it. He achieved total victory over the justice system, but in doing so, he may have lost any chance for redemption or peace. The millions of dollars he hid away, the businesses he infiltrated, the political influence he wielded, all of it now exists as a phantom limb on the body of American society, a reminder of the damage he caused, but the man himself has been reduced to a story, a case study, a footnote in history books. The family he sought to protect and elevate lived their lives in the long, inescapable shadow of his notoriety, their inheritance a mixture of immense wealth and a name forever associated with violence and corruption. The city he called home is, in many ways, better off for his passing, slowly healing from the deep, systemic corruption he helped to institutionalize. The legacy of Tony Accardo, therefore, is not a simple one of success or failure, but a complex tapestry of brilliant strategy and profound human cost, a life that serves as both an instruction manual for the perfect criminal and a solemn warning about the spiritual bankruptcy that is its ultimate reward. He proved that it is possible to win the game, but his life begs the question, what is the value of a victory that requires the surrender of one's own soul? He remains an enigma, a paradox, a chillingly effective ghost whose methods are admired even as his actions are condemned, a permanent and unsettling figure in the landscape of American crime. To dissect the unparalleled longevity and success of Tony Accardo is to move beyond the simplistic narratives of brute force and into the realm of advanced psychological and managerial theory, for his reign was a masterwork of applied human dynamics, a dark art that he perfected through decades of observation, experimentation, and execution. His leadership style was a unique hybrid of paternalistic benefactor and cold-blooded corporate eliminator, a combination that inspired a loyalty so fierce it often bordered on religious devotion among his inner circle. He understood the fundamental drivers of human behavior within his world, the desire for security, the hunger for respect, and the lure of financial reward. He catered to these needs with the precision of a master manipulator. A soldier who performed a difficult task with efficiency and discretion would find himself rewarded not just with a generous cash bonus, but with something even more valuable, a moment of personal recognition from the boss himself, a quiet word of thanks, a subtle promotion in status that signaled to everyone that this man was in Accardo's favor. This created a powerful incentive structure where excellence was tangibly rewarded and loyalty was cultivated as the highest virtue. He provided for the families of his incarcerated soldiers, he offered interest-free loans to those in temporary difficulty, and he settled disputes between his captains with a Solomon-like wisdom that, while final and often brutal, was generally perceived as fair within the warped moral framework of their society. This carefully cultivated image of the benevolent, wise leader, however, was underpinned by the ever-present, terrifying specter of Joe Batters. The legend of his violent origins was not a past he lived down, it was a foundational myth he actively maintained, a crucial tool of management. He never needed to remind people of his capacity for violence directly, the nickname alone, whispered in the right context, was enough to convey volumes. This allowed the older, more refined Accardo to remain above the fray, to be the calm, rational decision-maker, while the ghost of his younger self acted as the ultimate enforcer. The threat was so potent precisely because it was so rarely used in person. When violence was ordered, it was carried out with surgical precision by others, and the consequences were so absolute and terrifying that they served as a lesson for years. This strategic delegation of violence was another key to his insulation. He was never physically present, his hands were never dirty in the immediate sense, yet the fear of his order was as potent as the act itself. Furthermore, he possessed an almost preternatural ability to read people, to identify their strengths, their weaknesses, their hidden ambitions, and their secret fears. He would use this knowledge to balance the power dynamics within his organization, ensuring that no single underling became too powerful. He would promote rivalries just enough to keep his captains competitive and focused on outperforming each other for his favor, but he would never allow those rivalries to escalate into a civil war that could threaten the stability of the entire enterprise. He was a master of what modern management would call compartmentalization. Different crews were assigned different tasks with minimal knowledge of the operations of others. This not only increased efficiency through specialization, but it also protected the organization from a single point of failure. If one crew was compromised by law enforcement or turned informant, the damage could be contained. The left hand rarely knew what the right hand was doing, and only Accardo, at the very center of the web, possessed the complete picture. This structure mirrored that of a modern intelligence agency, and it was decades ahead of its time in the underworld. His personal demeanor was his most powerful weapon. In a world populated by volatile, emotional, and often egotistical men, Accardo's quiet calm was unnerving and commanding. He spoke sparingly, listened intently, and his silence was often more powerful than any outburst of anger. He maintained an aura of inscrutability that kept everyone off balance. No one could ever be sure what he was truly thinking, what he knew, or what his next move would be. This constant uncertainty bred a pervasive caution among his subordinates, a fear of making a mistake or, worse, of being perceived as disloyal. He managed his own public persona with the same care, crafting the image of a quiet, successful businessman, a family man, a generous donor to local charities, all of which served to create a shield of plausible deniability that was virtually impenetrable. In essence, Tony Accardo was the complete antithesis of the stereotypical gangster. He was not a charismatic showman like Capone, nor a paranoid bully like Giancana. He was a quiet, strategic, and deeply intelligent systems architect who understood that true, lasting power is not seized in a dramatic moment, but is built slowly, patiently, and systematically through a complex interplay of incentive, fear, structure, and above all, an unwavering discipline that governed his every word, his every action, and his every relationship until the very last day of his long and meticulously managed life. The stark and defining contrast between Tony Accardo and his infamous predecessor, Al Capone, provides the clearest possible illustration of the evolutionary leap he engineered within the world of organized crime, a shift from a brutish, industrial-era model of predation to a sleek, sophisticated, information-age model of systemic integration. Where Capone was the flamboyant, front-page CEO, Accardo was the anonymous, shadowy chairman of the board, and this fundamental difference in style dictated every aspect of their respective empires. Capone's reign was built on a foundation of terror, but it was a loud, public, and ultimately unsustainable terror. He understood the power of the headline, of the public execution, of making an example of his enemies in the most gruesome and visible way possible, as witnessed in the brutal St. Valentine's Day massacre. This strategy, while effective in the short term for consolidating power, had a critical flaw. It made him the most famous gangster in the world, a symbol of lawlessness that demanded a proportional response from society and the federal government. He became a target, and his notoriety ultimately led to his downfall, as authorities, unable to pin major crimes on him, found a simpler, more prosaic charge, tax evasion, to bring him to heel. Accardo, who had served in Capone's organization and witnessed this spectacular rise and fall firsthand, internalized the lesson completely. He understood that in the modern world, visibility was vulnerability. His reign was built on a foundation of silence. The violence he authorized was not for public consumption, it was a private, internal matter, a form of corporate restructuring. A problematic individual would simply disappear, his body buried in a secret location, his absence serving as a quiet, chilling memo to the rest of the organization about the cost of failure or disloyalty. This method did not generate headlines, it generated whispers, and whispers were a currency of fear that was far more valuable and durable than the transient shock of a public massacre. While Capone reveled in his celebrity, holding press conferences and posing for photographs, Accardo actively shunned the limelight, cultivating a persona of such profound blandness that he became virtually invisible to the general public. His name was not in the papers, his face was not on magazine covers, and this anonymity was his greatest strategic asset. It allowed him to operate for decades without becoming a symbol that required dismantling. Financially, the two men were also worlds apart. Capone's wealth, while vast, was largely liquid and ostentatiously displayed. He was a consumer, buying mansions, custom-made suits, and armored cars. Accardo, the corporate strategist, was an investor. He plowed the outfit's profits back into the business, diversifying its portfolio, buying into legitimate enterprises, and laundering money through complex schemes that would take the government decades to even begin to understand. Capone's operation was a predatory monopoly. Accardo's was a diversified holding company with a private equity arm. Furthermore, their relationships with political and law enforcement power structures differed radically. Capone's corruption was often transactional and blatant, a straightforward bribe for a specific favor. Accardo, learning from the more subtle approaches of men like Paul Ricca and Murray Humphreys, pursued a strategy of systemic corruption. He didn't just bribe a police captain to look the other way on a specific night, he cultivated long-term relationships with judges, politicians, and union leaders, creating a deep, symbiotic network of mutual interest where the outfit's power and the official's career became intertwined. This was a more patient, more expensive, but infinitely more stable and far-reaching form of control. It wasn't about avoiding the law for a single event, it was about subtly bending the entire legal and political framework to serve the organization's long-term interests. In the end, the comparison serves as the ultimate summary of Accardo's genius. Capone's story is a Shakespearean tragedy, a rapid ascent followed by a precipitous fall, a dramatic arc that has fueled countless books and films. Accardo's story lacks that dramatic arc, it is a flat, unwavering line of sustained, quiet power, stretching across 7 decades. Capone died a broken man, his mind ravaged by syphilis, his empire dissolved. Accardo died in his own bed, of natural causes, his mind sharp, his empire only beginning its final decline after his passing. Capone proved that a man could seize a city through sheer force of will and violence. Accardo proved something far more profound and terrifying, that a man could become the city, weaving his organization so deeply into its economic, political, and social fabric that extracting it became impossible, and that the most powerful criminal is not the one who makes the most noise, but the one who operates in a silence so complete that the world barely knows he exists until long after he is gone. The mythologizing of Tony Accardo began not after his death, but while he still walked the earth, a quiet process of legend building that was fueled by the very silence and impunity he so carefully cultivated. In the absence of facts, speculation flourished. In the absence of a public persona, a more potent, shadowy figure was constructed in the collective imagination of the underworld and the law enforcement agencies that pursued him. He became less a man and more a specter, a set of principles, a ghost story told to illustrate a point about power, discipline, and the ultimate limits of the justice system. Within the ranks of the Chicago outfit, he was spoken of in hushed, reverential tones, his name invoked not with casual familiarity but with the solemnity one might use for a founding father. His edicts were not questioned, his strategies were studied, and his personal habits, his disdain for hard liquor, his punctuality, his conservative dress, were emulated by aspiring mobsters who saw in him the blueprint for a long and prosperous career. The legend of Joe Batters was the foundational myth, the dark origin story that gave weight to his later, more refined persona. It was a tale that needed no embellishment, for its stark truth, that this calm, corporate chairman had once been the most feared enforcer of the Capone era, was terrifying enough. This duality was the core of his myth, the man who could, in one lifetime, be both the brutal instrument of violence and the brilliant architect of a system designed to make such violence seem almost obsolete. For law enforcement, particularly the FBI agents who spent their careers on his trail, he became the ultimate puzzle, the unsolvable case, the one who got away. He was their white whale, a symbol of their own limitations and the frustrating adaptability of organized crime. They would hold conferences and brainstorming sessions, trying to decipher his methods, to find a chink in his armor, only to be met with another dead end, another fruitless surveillance log, another witness too afraid to speak. This decades-long stalemate only added to his legend. Every failed prosecution, every overturned conviction, every fruitless wiretap was another layer of varnish on the statue of his invincibility. In the wider culture, his obscurity was, paradoxically, his most famous feature. While names like Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky entered the popular lexicon, Accardo remained a vague, peripheral figure, known only to true crime aficionados and historians. This was exactly how he wanted it. He became the Quiet Dawn, the unknown Godfather, titles that, while accurate, also served to heighten the mystery and allure around him. After his death, the myth only grew, freed from the constraints of the living man. He became a subject of academic study, a case study in criminal management and organizational theory. Business analysts, stripping away the moral context, would point to his corporate structure, his diversification strategy, and his risk management protocols as models of efficient enterprise, however illicit. His life story became a dark American fable about the nature of success itself, a narrative that asked uncomfortable questions about the thin line between a corporate raider and a mob boss, between ambition and ruthlessness, between wealth earned and wealth taken. The places associated with him took on an almost sacred quality in the lore. The River Forest Estate, with its silent merry-go-round, became a pilgrimage site for those fascinated by his story, a physical monument to his unique brand of power. The myth of Tony Accardo endures because it speaks to a universal fascination with mastery and control. He represents the ultimate self-made man, a figure who built an empire with his own intellect and will, operating entirely outside the conventional rules of society. He is the dark counterpart to the classic American success story, a reminder that the qualities we often celebrate, ambition, innovation, strategic thinking, discipline, can be harnessed for profoundly destructive ends. His legend is not one of redemption or tragic flaw, but of cold, consistent, and triumphant efficiency. He is the ghost that haunts the American dream, a proof that the system can be beaten, that the rules can be rewritten by those with the intelligence and the nerve to do so, and that the price for such a victory, while immense, is a price that some are willing to pay. He remains the benchmark, the unattainable standard, the criminal who perfected the art of crime not by committing the most audacious acts, but by mastering the art of never getting caught, leaving behind a legacy that is less about what he did, and more about how perfectly, how utterly completely, he got away with it. As the final years of the 20th century unfolded and the world moved on from the era that had defined Tony Accardo, the physical and institutional remnants of his empire began to fade, but the philosophical and historical questions he raised have only grown more persistent and profound with time. The Chicago outfit, that once impregnable fortress of illicit power, continued its descent into a state of managed decline, a pale, anemic shadow of the corporate titan it had been under his chairmanship. The men who inherited the crumbling organization were mere custodians of a dying legacy, their operations reduced to low-level gambling, residual labor racketeering, and occasional forays into street-level lending, a far cry from the days when they influenced national politics and built the Las Vegas Strip. The sophisticated corporate structure Accardo had meticulously engineered was dismantled, not by a rival syndicate, but by the relentless pressure of the RICO statute and the increasingly common phenomenon of high-ranking members choosing to become government witnesses, a betrayal that would have been unthinkable in Accardo's prime. The Code of Omerta, the sacred vow of silence that he had embodied and enforced with absolute finality, was now a relic, rendered obsolete by the modern prosecutor's power to offer deals and the modern criminal's willingness to trade secrets for a reduced sentence. The city of Chicago itself underwent a transformation, slowly scrubbing away the overt corruption that had been a feature of its political and economic life for generations, though the deep, systemic roots planted by Accardo and his peers would never be fully extracted. In a broader sense, his life forces a re-examination of the very nature of crime and power in a capitalist democracy. He demonstrated with chilling clarity that in a society obsessed with wealth and success, the line between a ruthless corporate CEO who devastates communities through legal but predatory practices and a crime boss who does the same through illegal ones can become dangerously blurred. Both operate with a primary focus on the bottom line. Both understand the power of leverage and the utility of political influence, and both are often shielded from the direct consequences of their actions by layers of bureaucracy and obfuscation. Accardo was simply the pure, unvarnished expression of this ethos, unconstrained by regulations or shareholder reports. His story is a dark mirror held up to the American dream, reflecting the unsettling truth that the skills required to build a criminal empire, strategic vision, financial acumen, personnel management, and relentless discipline, are the same skills celebrated in the halls of Wall Street and Silicon Valley. The primary difference is one of legality, not necessarily of character or method. This uncomfortable parallel is a significant part of his enduring fascination. Furthermore, his life poses a fundamental question about justice itself. By every measurable standard of the legal system, Tony Accardo was an unrepentant, prolific, and immensely successful criminal. Yet, that same system, despite its vast resources and unwavering determination, failed completely to hold him accountable. He died not just a free man, but a victorious one, having outmaneuvered, outlasted, and humiliated the forces of law and order for 7 decades. This outcome challenges our innate desire for narrative justice, for the world to be a place where evil is punished and good triumphs. The story of Tony Accardo provides no such comfort. It suggests a world where intelligence and discipline, when applied without moral restraint, can indeed triumph, at least in the earthly realm. It is a story without a moral, a tale where the villain wins, grows old, sees his family, and passes away peacefully in his sleep. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his legacy, the proof that the universe is not inherently just, and that a man can live a life of profound evil and still achieve every worldly measure of success. He is a permanent crack in the foundation of our collective belief in an orderly and fair world, a reminder that the scales of justice can be, and often are, balanced by the weight of sheer, unadulterated cunning. The world has moved on, the specific methods of his outfit are now historical curiosities, but the underlying questions his life posed about power, morality, and the flawed nature of human justice remain as relevant and unsettling today as they were at the peak of his silent, unassailable power. And so, the long and singular story of Anthony Tony Accardo, known to a chosen few as Joe Batters, reaches its inevitable and quiet conclusion, a narrative that stretches across the vast expanse of 20th century America, from the crowded immigrant tenements of Chicago's Old West Side to the sun-bleached retirement villas of Palm Springs. A journey of unparalleled audacity and discipline that remains without equal in the annals of American crime. He was a man of his time, a product of the brutal alchemy of Prohibition and the Great Depression, yet he was also a man far ahead of his time, a visionary who saw the future of illicit power not in the chaotic violence of the street, but in the calm, calculated order of the corporate boardroom. He was the architect who redesigned organized crime, transforming it from a parasitic enterprise into a symbiotic one, weaving its threads so deeply into the fabric of the legitimate economy that to remove it would risk unraveling the entire tapestry. His legacy is a complex and enduring one, a tapestry woven with threads of brilliant strategy and profound human tragedy, of unwavering loyalty and absolute ruthlessness, of immense worldly success and a deep, unspoken spiritual poverty. He stands as the ultimate paradox, the most successful gangster in history, yet a figure whose name remains obscure to the general public, a man who ordered countless murders, yet who was a devoted family man, a kingpin who operated a vast criminal empire, yet who never spent a single night in jail. He proved that it is possible to win the game by rewriting its rules, by substituting silence for bravado, strategy for impulse, and corporate structure for chaotic ambition. He demonstrated that the most effective power is often the power that is never seen, never heard, and never proven. Yet, for all his success, his life serves as a profound and lasting caution. The empire he built with such care did not long survive him, decaying into irrelevance without his guiding intelligence. The wealth he amassed, while securing every physical comfort for his family, could not purchase the one thing he may have truly needed in the end, peace of mind and a clear conscience. He achieved a form of immortality, but it is a dark immortality, a legacy etched not in honor but in infamy, a name that will forever be associated with the cold, efficient exercise of illicit power. The world has changed immeasurably since his passing. The digital age has created new frontiers for crime and new tools for law enforcement, making his specific methods a subject for the history books. But the essential lessons of his life, about the nature of power, the allure of ambition, the fragility of justice, and the high cost of a life lived without moral boundaries, these lessons remain timeless and universally relevant. He is a permanent fixture in the landscape of American history, a dark star whose gravitational pull continues to fascinate, horrify, and instruct. The story of Tony Accardo is now complete, a chronicle pieced together from the whispers of history, the fragments of declassified files, and the silent testimony of a life lived in the shadows. It is a story that needed to be told, not to glorify, but to understand, to look unflinchingly into the darkness and comprehend the mechanics of a success built on a foundation of fear and corruption. His long, quiet war with the forces of law and order is over, ending not in a dramatic shootout or a prison cell, but in the simple, undeniable silence of a natural death. He cheated justice, he defied every odd, and he lived his life entirely on his own terms, leaving behind a mystery that will never be fully solved and a legacy that continues to challenge our understanding of crime, power, and the price of success in America. And if the intricate, shadowy world of true crime and the hidden mechanics of power hold a fascination for you, If you wish to delve deeper into the stories that shaped our world from the darkness, then we invite you to explore our channel further. Like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you do not miss our next journey into the forgotten corners of history. Your support allows us to continue bringing these comprehensive, meticulously researched narratives to light. Thank you for listening. The echo of Tony Accardo's life, now receding 3 decades into the past, leaves us not with a simple verdict but with a lingering, complex resonance that continues to vibrate through our understanding of power, legacy, and the very structure of American society itself. To consider his 90-year journey is to confront the unsettling reality that evil is not always, or even often, a flamboyant or chaotic force. It can be patient, disciplined, intelligent, and terrifyingly efficient. He was not a disruptor, he was a system builder. His great achievement was not in breaking the world, but in building a new one within the shell of the old, a parallel society with its own laws, its own economy, and its own ruthless form of justice. The sprawling, silent empire he commanded was a perverse testament to the American ideals of ambition and enterprise, a dark counterpart to the legitimate dreams of millions of immigrants who sought a better life through hard work. He took the same raw materials, ambition, intelligence, a willingness to take risks, and channeled them into the creation of a machine designed for predation. The ultimate lesson of his life may be that the potential for great good and great evil resides in the same human qualities, and the path one takes is determined not by ability, but by character and choice. The institutions he corrupted, the political systems he manipulated, and the labor unions he hijacked were all, in their ideal forms, designed to empower and protect the common man. Accardo saw in them not a purpose to serve, but a vulnerability to exploit. He turned the tools of community and commerce into weapons of control and extraction. And in doing so, he held up a mirror to the legitimate world, revealing how thin the veneer of civilization can be and how susceptible our most trusted institutions are to a determined and patient adversary operating from within. His story forces us to ask difficult questions about our own society. Where do the boundaries between aggressive business and criminal enterprise truly lie? When does ambition become ruthlessness? When does leverage become extortion? He exists in the hazy space between the boardroom and the back alley, a permanent reminder that the methods of power are often universal, and only the context defines their legality. For the city of Chicago, his passing did not instantly heal the deep wounds he and his kind had inflicted. Corruption does not vanish with the corruptor. It lingers in systems, in habits, in unspoken agreements that take generations to unlearn. The outfit's decline was a necessary cleansing, but the ghost of its power, the memory of its reach, remains a part of the city's DNA, a cautionary tale etched into its history. For the rest of us, observing from a distance, Tony Accardo becomes a historical figure of immense significance, not for his morality, but for his methodology. He is a case study in the absolute extreme of criminal success, a data point that proves the upper limits of what is possible when a brilliant mind is applied entirely without ethical constraint. His life is a manual on the art of evasion, the science of silence, and the architecture of power. He is the benchmark. And while the specific crimes of the Prohibition and post-war eras may be a thing of the past, the underlying dynamics he mastered, corruption, money laundering, the infiltration of legitimate business, are more relevant than ever in our globalized, complex world. The players and the platforms have changed, but the game remains the same. The story of Tony Accardo, therefore, is not a closed book. It is an ongoing lesson, a permanent part of the curriculum on the nature of power. It teaches that the most dangerous enemies of a free society are not the ones who storm the gates, but the ones who, like Accardo, quietly, patiently, and brilliantly learn to pick the locks and become the gatekeepers, ruling from the shadows until the very concept of a gate becomes meaningless. His long, quiet walk through the 20th century leaves behind a chilling legacy, proof that a man can indeed conquer his world, but in the process, he may forfeit his very soul, achieving a victory that is as empty as it is absolute, a kingdom of shadows that vanishes with the rising sun, leaving behind only the cold, hard fact of what one man, with enough will and enough cunning, can get away with. And so, we arrive at the end of our journey, a deep and comprehensive exploration of a life lived in the deepest shadows of the American century, a narrative that has stretched over 22 chapters and thousands of words, all dedicated to unraveling the enigma of Tony Accardo. We have traced his path from the eager, violent youth known as Joe Batters to the untouchable corporate chairman of the nation's most powerful criminal syndicate. We have delved into the financial architecture of his empire, the psychological mastery of his leadership, and the relentless, yet futile, pursuit by the forces of law and order. We have stood witness to his quiet family life and his brutal business decisions, his moments of calculated generosity and his orders of absolute finality. This entire saga, pieced together from countless historical sources, FBI files, and the whispers of history, has been presented to you with one primary goal: to provide a definitive, unbiased, and thoroughly engaging account of how one man defied every odd and rewrote the rules of power. The story is now complete, the final chapter written. But the pursuit of understanding, the thirst for knowledge about the hidden forces that have shaped our world, does not end here. Our channel is dedicated to bringing you more of these meticulously researched, deeply narrated deep dives into the most fascinating figures and events from history's darker corners. If you have found this journey into the life and mind of Tony Accardo compelling, if you appreciate content that goes beyond the surface to deliver a truly immersive experience, then your partnership is crucial. I strongly encourage you to become an active part of our community by liking this video, which allows the algorithm to share this story with other curious minds like yours. Subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you will not miss our next detailed exploration, whether it be another shadowy figure from the world of organized crime, a pivotal moment in history, or an unsolved mystery that demands a fresh look. By subscribing, you are not just a viewer, you are a patron of in-depth storytelling, ensuring that content with this level of detail and care continues to be produced. Share your thoughts, your reflections, and your suggestions for future topics in the comments below. Your engagement fuels this journey of discovery. The story of Tony Accardo is closed, but countless other stories are waiting in the wings, stories of power, intrigue, crime, and consequence that are equally complex and captivating. Your support is what brings these narratives to light. Thank you for your time, your attention, and your commitment to understanding the intricate tapestry of our past. This has been the story of Tony Accardo. Until our next exploration, farewell. The grave, as it must for all men, ultimately claimed Tony Accardo, but the idea of him, the spectral blueprint of his methodology, remains unburied, a ghost in the machine of power that continues to haunt our collective imagination. To dismiss him as merely a successful gangster is to miss the profound, almost philosophical, challenge his existence poses. He was, in his own dark way, a radical, a revolutionary who rejected the social contract and built his own nation-state within the borders of another, a state whose currency was fear, whose laws were silence, and whose borders were defined by his own influence. He demonstrated that the institutions we rely upon for order, the law, the government, the free market, are not immutable forces of nature but are, in fact, fragile human constructs, susceptible to a sufficiently intelligent and determined counterforce. His life is a permanent question mark scribbled in the margin of American history, challenging the comforting narrative of inevitable justice and moral order. Long after the specific details of his criminal ventures have faded into archival dust, the central paradox of his being will endure, that the very qualities we are taught to admire and cultivate, discipline, loyalty, strategic thinking, financial acumen, and an unwavering commitment to one's goals, can, when divorced from a moral compass, create a monster of terrifying efficiency. He is the dark doppelganger of the captain of industry, the successful businessman whose product was fear and whose customer was everyone within his reach. In the quiet, normal streets of America's suburbs, in the boardrooms of its corporations, and in the halls of its government, the ghost of Tony Accardo lingers not as a literal presence, but as a cautionary specter. He is a reminder that the thirst for power is a fundamental human drive, and that it can be quenched in many ways, some sanctioned by society, and some operating in the vast, gray, and black markets that exist just beneath its surface. The world has technologically evolved beyond the payphone and the handwritten ledger he used, but the human vulnerabilities he exploited, greed, fear, ambition, remain unchanged. The modern-day cybercriminal who infiltrates a multinational corporation from a remote keyboard and the corrupt official who trades influence for wealth are, in their essence, operating on the same core principles that Accardo perfected: identify a weakness, apply leverage, and profit from the imbalance. He is the archetype, the original model of the modern predatory enterprise. His story does not end with his death, it simply enters a new phase, transforming from a biography into a legend, and from a legend into a warning. He is a part of the American tapestry, a dark thread woven into the national fabric, reminding us that the dream of ultimate success can sometimes be a nightmare for everyone else. The quiet, well-dressed man who loved his family and built a playground in his backyard was also the architect of a system of profound suffering and corruption. This is the ultimate, unresolvable contradiction of Anthony Accardo. He forces us to accept that a human being is not a simple equation, but a complex universe of conflicting truths, capable of profound love and profound cruelty, of creating a sanctuary for his children and a hell for his enemies. He is the proof that a man can be two things at once, and that the world is not divided into heroes and villains, but is populated by individuals who contain the capacity for both, their legacy determined by which capacity they choose to feed. The echo of his life is the sound of a door closing on a specific era of crime, but it is also the sound of that same door being left slightly ajar, a permanent invitation to remember, to reflect, and to remain vigilant, for the world will always have its shadows, and in those shadows, the lessons of Tony Accardo will always, and forever, be relevant. And so, we have reached the true and final conclusion of our epic exploration, a journey that has spanned the entirety of a hidden century, a narrative meticulously reconstructed from the silent testimony of history to bring you the most complete and immersive account of a life unlike any other. From the first swing of the baseball bat that earned him his infamous moniker to the last quiet breath he took in the security of his own home, we have followed the unbroken thread of Tony Accardo's existence, a thread woven with the dark silk of violence, the cold steel of strategy, and the paradoxical gold of familial devotion. We have navigated the intricate corridors of his corporate-style criminal empire, understood the psychological genius of his leadership, and stood as silent witnesses to his decades-long duel with a justice system that possessed all the power but none of his patience or guile. This entire chronicle, presented to you in a single, continuous narration, was undertaken with the solemn commitment to deliver not just facts, but understanding, not just a story, but the full, unvarnished context of a man who became a force of nature. We have seen the rise, the reign, and the quiet, natural downfall of the last true Godfather, a man who conquered not through loud proclamations, but through a silence so profound it became his most powerful weapon. The tale is now told. The file is closed. But our shared mission to uncover the deepest truths of history's most compelling figures is a journey that never truly ends. If this deep, detailed, and calm narrative has held your attention, if you value storytelling that respects your intelligence and rewards your curiosity with unparalleled depth, then the next step is yours to take. I strongly urge you to support this channel by liking this video, an action that signals to the platform the value of this kind of intensive, long-form content and helps it find its way to other viewers who crave substance over sensation. Subscribe to the channel and firmly press the notification bell. By doing so, you are not merely adding to a number, you are enlisting in a community dedicated to uncovering the stories that matter, stories told with care, respect for the truth, and a commitment to the art of narration. Your subscription ensures that our next investigative journey, be it into the life of another shadowy titan of history, a pivotal unsolved mystery, or a forgotten chapter of our past, will reach you directly. Let us know in the comments below which enigmatic figure or event you believe we should delve into next. Your voice is an essential part of this ongoing exploration. The saga of Tony Accardo is complete, but the world is filled with countless other stories waiting for a voice to give them life. Your engagement is the key that unlocks them. Thank you for your time, for your trust, and for your appreciation of narrative depth. This was the story of Tony Accardo. Until our next journey into the heart of history, farewell and thank you for listening. The ultimate, unassailable truth of Tony Accardo's existence, the final lesson that echoes through the decades since his passing, is that he fundamentally redefined the very architecture of power within the American underworld, leaving behind a legacy that is less about the man himself and more about the chillingly effective system he engineered, a system that proved, with mathematical certainty, that a sufficiently disciplined and intelligent criminal operation could become not just a rival to the legitimate world, but a parasite so deeply embedded in its host that it became a permanent, self-sustaining part of its ecosystem. His story forces an uncomfortable but necessary evolution in our understanding of criminal mastery. We can no longer view the most successful gangsters as merely lucky or exceptionally violent, but must recognize them as canny CEOs, strategic thinkers of a high order who operate in a marketplace where the currency is human weakness and the product is control. Accardo was the ultimate pragmatist, a man who viewed morality as a superfluous constraint, a variable that could be eliminated from the equation of success without any negative impact on the bottom line. In his world, there were no moral victories, only practical outcomes, and by that ruthless metric, his life was an unqualified triumph. He achieved every tangible goal he could have set for himself: immense wealth, absolute authority within his domain, the longevity to enjoy his spoils, and the preservation of his family, all while evading the one consequence, incarceration, that defines failure in his profession. This cold, hard calculus of his success stands as a permanent challenge to our societal narratives about justice and karma, presenting us with the unsettling reality that in the earthly realm, evil can indeed prosper, and can do so on a grand, sustained, and magnificent scale if it is guided by a mind of sufficient caliber. He is the exception that disproves the rule, the outlier data point that forces us to reconsider our entire model of how the world works. His life is a monument to the power of the human will when it is applied without distraction or doubt, a testament to what can be accomplished when every action, every word, and every relationship is subordinated to a single, overarching objective. And yet, for all that, his legacy is also one of profound emptiness, a haunting void where a soul should have been. The empire he built did not outlive him by more than a few years, dissolving into the mediocrity from which it had risen. The fortune he amassed, while still benefiting his descendants, is now just money, its violent origins fading into a historical footnote. The fear he commanded died with the men who knew him, and the city he once held in his grip has transformed, its memory of him growing fainter with each passing year. He won his freedom, but he lived as a prisoner of his own design. He achieved power, but it was a power that could only be exercised in the shadows. He secured his family's future, but he burdened them with a name forever associated with brutality and corruption. This is the final, paradoxical lesson of Tony Accardo, that a life dedicated entirely to the pursuit of worldly success, when divorced from any higher purpose or moral foundation, ultimately culminates in a victory that is as hollow as it is complete. He is the definitive answer to a question we are often afraid to ask: what does a man profit, if he shall gain the whole world, but lose his own soul? Tony Accardo gained his world, and in the process, he demonstrated the exact dimensions and the precise value of that transaction for all of history to see. His story is now complete. If you have found this deep, reflective journey into the heart of a criminal genius to be of value, if you believe in the power of long-form storytelling to uncover profound truths, then your support is vital. Please like this video to help this narrative reach others who seek understanding. Subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell to join us as we continue to explore the most complex and captivating stories from the annals of history. Your engagement is what makes this deep dive into the past possible. Thank you for your time and your thoughtful attention. This was the story of Tony Accardo. The final chapter is now written. And so, we arrive at the absolute terminus of our journey, the final, quiet note in the long and complex symphony of a life lived in the shadows. We have traversed the entire landscape of Tony Accardo's world, from the gritty streets of his youth to the opulent, guarded fortresses of his old age, from the visceral violence that forged his legend to the cerebral, corporate strategies that sustained his empire for over half a century. We have dissected his financial web, analyzed his psychological mastery, and chronicled his relentless, unyielding Cold War with the forces of law and order. Every facet of this narrative has been presented to you with a singular dedication to depth, clarity, and a calm, authoritative narration, all with the goal of providing the most comprehensive and engaging account possible of the most successful criminal in American history. The story is now complete, the final period placed at the end of a sentence that spanned 86 years. The investigation is over. The evidence has been presented. The jury of history has all the facts it needs to render its verdict. But our shared quest for understanding does not end here, it merely turns the page to a new chapter. This channel is founded on the principle that true storytelling requires patience, depth, and a profound respect for the complexity of history. If you have valued this immense undertaking, if you appreciate content that refuses to skim the surface and instead dives deep into the heart of darkness to bring back a story of unparalleled detail and narrative power, then your partnership is essential. I must now make a final, direct appeal to you, our valued viewer. Please, take a moment to like this video. This simple action is the lifeblood of this channel, a signal to the algorithm that content of this substance and scale has an audience that craves more. It ensures that this story finds its way to other curious minds who are tired of superficial summaries and hunger for the full, unvarnished truth. Furthermore, and this is critically important, subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell. Do not let this be the end of our exploration. By subscribing, you are casting a vote for long-form, meticulously researched documentary storytelling. You are ensuring that you will be the first to embark on our next deep dive into history's greatest mysteries, its most enigmatic figures, and its most pivotal, untold events. The story of Tony Accardo is finished, but countless other stories of equal power and intrigue await their turn in the spotlight. Your subscription is the key that brings them to life. Let us know in the comments what shadowy chapter of history you wish us to investigate next. Your voice guides our future journeys. This monumental effort, this complete history of Tony Accardo, has been presented for you, and for all who seek to understand the intricate mechanics of power. Thank you for your unwavering attention, for your appreciation of narrative craft, and for your commitment to seeing a story through to its absolute, definitive end. This was the story of Tony Accardo. There is no more. The archive is closed. Thank you, and goodbye.